Is it over? Is it end times? You're turning 30 years old. The gray hairs are coming in. We've already witnessed Cloud9 winning Boston. We've already witnessed the glorious ASTRALIS era and the thing that we thought would never end. We've already witnessed the Paris major final and Daewoo and Apex and everybody winning in the Accor Arena in front of their French home crowd, and finished CSGO. Now have brought up CS2, and it's got all these movement problems and people are just not happy with it. And Rops and Nico are talking about how this game is not developed enough for the amount of time that it's out. And we have no more teams putting up eras. Have we peaked? Is it really the end of eras? That would be a sad day for me, because for me, dominance shows us the ceiling of the game. And that's why we want top teams to be consistently good. And that's why I dedicated this channel and our Twitter group to hating on teams for even being slightly less than incredible week to week, even though they have to play officials every day, then go back and scrim, then have an hour team talk, then lose 50 to 60% of their matches, then go try again at the next tournament where I show up and I just get the cask and I can't get eliminated from tournaments and I just get to criticize them freely. That's why I go so hard on them, because I want a team to be at the top and stay there. So why don't we go back in time and talk about the eras and how they built on each other to the point of today, where the HLTV top 1 team in the world doesn't really matter. Whoever is the best team at the last tournament, who knows if they're going to be the best at the next one. That's the period of time that we're at in CS. So let's go back and find out why we've gotten to this point. Starting at the beginning, this won't be the first time that I've talked about this, but when we talk about what makes NIP great, we have to talk about the individuals and their structure, okay? What were their accomplishments? Well, NIP were the team to go 87-0 on LAN maps, and that was a famous, unbeaten, historic LAN map win record streak, okay, that they have to their name. They eventually ended up winning their one major final after losing 3 out of the 4 that they were in Cologne in 2014. Glorious moment. Capstone of their run after being so dominant in 2013. Their expectations were too high and they ended up getting crushed by FNATIC at the first ever major. That would have made the beginning of CSGO even more incredible, but still, the impact is there. NIP were a team that at the time, with a very undeveloped esports scene, nobody knew exactly who the caller was, really. Like, we heard that it was Exist, but then we also saw that they played a classic Swedish defaulty play style where it would be get right, just pulling off of these lurks and pulling out 1v3s in back-to-back rounds, even when people knew he was flanking. Then there was the fact that Force was coming in as the other player who, with Get Right, him and Neo, considered the best CS 1.6 players in history, 2 of which are now on the same team to create NIP, and they are frying, right? They are doing so well off the back of their individual star level, their comfort in defaults, their history of experience between their source players in Freiburg and Faflaren, as well as their 1.6 all-star legend players, all being Swedish, all coming together. There's the perfect mixture, the perfect recipe to start off strong. That was the time and place for Sweden, right? But that style of play didn't last very long, and you could say maybe it was too defaulty, right? It was too simplistic. The way they called, you couldn't even tell who the IGL was. How would you define their style? Individual, lurk heavy, right? Relied on Get Right getting back-to-back #1 player in the worlds, you know?
Chicken coop! Chicken fucking coop! God fucking damn it! Kill him! God fucking spirit! He just fucking... Outside B! Outside B!
Drown out the haters with Ace Zone. Code launders for 10% off. Now shipping. Ace Zone wireless headphones. So what came along after that? Well, we fast forward then to FNATIC. And FNATIC obviously scooped up the first major, but the real lineup that put together an era wasn't the one with Schneider on it. It was JW, Flusha, Olaf Meister, Pronax, and Crims, right? This was the lineup that was the true heir of the era, if you will, and a follow-up on a previous Swedish iteration that wasn't quite that Swedish. I mean, they were individualistic, yes, but they were far more aggressive. Now, I think that the one common thing between FNATIC and NIP when we talk about eras at the beginning of the game, where they really highlighted individual level in their players. But with NIP, it was still a more classic Swedish, slower, defaulty play style with a very strong lurker on the team. With FNATIC, it was overt aggression, signature Opper in JW, and an unbelievably eclectic and irreplaceable mix of individuals, including someone like Flusha, who contended and damn near, and some people argue, got #1 player in the world in 2014. Flusha was just about as good as Get Right, but then you had JW. There wasn't even an Opper close to the level that JW brought. Still to this day, the best Swedish Opper in history, and he was doing that 10 years ago. And I just hung out with him actually at the GeoGuessr World Cup. He carried the trophy in before the grand final started, a very special moment. But we were reminiscing about old times and how they played on FNATIC, and obviously FNATIC were massively hated by a lot of people because they were the team that was known as the villains because of the Olaf pass boost and didn't want to shake someone's hand after winning a match. And JW talks a lot of smack, but that's actually now why we love them in retrospect. And Olaf Meister is also a player who gets #1 2 times in a row. He's a rifler who is the tip of the spear with Pronax calling rounds around him. You have so much coming out of FNATIC individually, just like Nip, but now with max power aggression, right? 6th gear aggression. That's what defines FNATIC. And still to this day, some people say that if you scaled up every era, right, and accounted for inflation, that FNATIC would be the only team who could take down ASTRALIS in their prime. I personally think that when we talk about our next roster, this team could also have contended with ASTRALIS. And for me, this era is the Brazilian CS era of Luminosity and SK. And we talk about Fallen, FNX, Fur, Taco, and coldzera. All right, this roster wins a major with 2 different organizations. In 2016, Luminosity signs this lineup, and there's this famous story where Flusha donated a certain amount of reals for them to compete at IEM Katowice and then at Cologne, and then they start to make waves for themselves, and they end up becoming so powerful with Fallen as well, who's a venerated player from 1.6. He was the very first superstar op IGL. So we have FNATIC breaking ground after NIP defaulty, individualistic, but slow playing. FNATIC outright aggression. So many signature star players on the lineup all performing at the same time. Impossible to copy. Sort of like massively influential, but at the same time, nobody's like them. Sort of like a Jay-Z, if you will.
Yeah, I'd like to solve the puzzle.
All right, go ahead.
Yep.
That's it, yeah.
And then you have Luminosity SK, who are also unlike the teams of the past with Fallen, proving that you can be a star op IGL, which at the time was a concept that people didn't believe was possible. And remember, you have to give so much credit to the Roger Bannisters of each era because they did something they didn't have an example of before, and they showed what the possibility could be. And after that, lots of people tried to be star IGL oppers, including Device having his hand at it today, Cadian doing it for Heroic, and so on. So there's Luminosity SK who have Fallen as the op IGL, who's, you know, the most feared opper while he's playing, and then also putting together a game plan that we haven't seen before. And the 2 signature parts about this era and how he did that was the Brazilian scene was known for being overly aggressive as well, in a different way though, in a more calculated way actually than FNATIC were. FNATIC were like kicking down your door and then taking fights with everybody who's pointing guns at the doorway, right? When it came to Luminosity SK, what they were doing as the meta was developing, they invented overpass map control by having Fur push downstairs and push out into Fountain. When you think about Rain and what he did on FaZe Clan on Overpass, it's all because of Fur. He modeled his playstyle totally after that sort of success that he had. And this is a core map for Luminosity and SK. And when we talk about their CT side, they were basically brave enough to call out when they felt like some team had left. So in the natural way around plays out on any map, it's like you're on T side, you take a piece of map control so that you push players back, like let's say Dust 2, you take long, then the CTs fall back. And while the CTs fall back, they look for map control on other parts of the map. That was Luminosity doing that. And also, it was Luminosity saying, okay, you took long control, but we don't believe you're there anymore. We're going to come and take over long control back from you. That's what they brought to Tier 1 CS. Really fast reclears instead of squeezing another part of the map for aggression solely. And they were very confident when it came to working the map and doing double push CT reclears, and that paid off huge for them. They also had coldzera to follow in the footsteps of Flusha, to follow in the footsteps of Get Right as an even more incredible lurker, an even more powerful and consistent level of player. And and Coldzera helps bring this team to the forefront. And you have basically just like everything working perfectly. Everything that you have from the past, you have so much signature playstyles in terms of a Fallen's op IGL. You have FNX, who's a very crafty like E-box player on train. You have Coldzera, who's like amazing lurker, who stands out and wins games by himself. And then you have Fur, who is just like massively aggressive and is willing to take fights with everyone. And then you have the CT reclears. You have the Fallen op IGL. This is the Luminosity SK period of time where it's a bit messy in there. They get their two majors. Some of their wins are a little bit staggered, but they're clearly like dominating this part of the era of CSGO that we're in.
Introducing the latest and greatest in Web3 technology. The NutTap 9000. When you tap, it nuts. The best part? It's free. Start tapping for nuts today at rivalrytoken.xyz/faucet.
And in between and before this, we do have a little bit of a French era, like the baguettes coming through, LDCZ, haha, we win on ecos. Yes, we have Kenny S, top 6 player in the world, massive cultural impact, all that, whatever. But they only get one major, cute. But anyways, we fast forward and now we get into some serious business, okay? And this is where you have Astralis, Blast being born at the same time. You have the Danish royal family investing in esports. You have cardboard cutouts of Astralis players at Fields, the biggest mall in Denmark. You walk down the street and people know Astralis more than they even know Counter-Strike. You're talking about now a period of time where Astralis are so dominant. 4 majors for the lineup as soon as Glaive joined, and they literally are more famous than the game they play in their country. This team ends up being so successful that at the exact same time that, you know, Blast is making a tournament circuit, and for many years this country just becomes ubiquitous with Counter-Strike and dominance, and they dominate in a way that nobody thought was possible, right? After a couple of years of jostling to figure out who was going to be the best team in the world and be very consistent, nobody thought that would end up being that TSM lineup. And how did Astralis define themselves in their era? Well, they did it through being the best at literally everything. And I think that this again shows that they've got everything that the previous eras had, and they've built upon the past successes of those former lineups and Luminosity, SK, FNATIC, and NIP, but then they also add a couple of more things. And so when you ask players what Astralis are so good at, the number one thing that stands out that isn't immediately obvious is the fact that they have the best punish game when it comes to making the most of your mistakes. They're very good at starting every round and being illegible, being so hard to read. They try to do the exact same play more ways than anybody else is really doing. And then the only thing on top, the explosive cherry on top, is their HEs and how they took a piece of utility to the next level. Nobody else had really done that at this point, okay? The only thing left is decoys now. People were already using smokes to not smoke off choke points, but to use defensively to look over top in your own site. People were already using flashes, pop flashing for teammates and lining up every single pixel perfect pop flash. It had all been perfected, right? And then Astralis said, hey, wait, there's actually something that people haven't been talking about recently. Ever in CS. We found something that has been under our noses this entire time you've been playing CSGO, and that's HE grenades. And that's where Astralis started double nading on certain timings on every part of the map and getting HE kills left, right, and center, to the point that everyone realized, well, HEs will slow you a bit. They'll also do impact immediate damage. And if you throw 2 at the same time, you can take someone down in a single second. And Astralis started abusing HEs to the point that you now have a team that have invented a part of the meta and also have mastered every other part of the meta and have the top 3 opper. You have the IGL that ends up being the IGL that wins them 4 majors. You have the best clutcher in the world, consistent feature with all of these teams as well. In terms of your sort of 5th player, your lurker in Zipix, he's winning games with his clutches and everything is operating at the highest level consistently. Then you have that signature thing that comes out as well, where they bring in HEs in a way that nobody else is prepared for. So Astralis end up putting together 4 majors, and I mean, it's at this point, you know, where Sadokist goes,
Season 8, Astralis are the champions of ESL Pro League, and for the first time in history, the best of all fucking time!
And it's like, there's no other way to describe it. They're the best fucking team of all time. And it basically seems impossible to ever meet that level of accomplishments. You can see all of the map win streaks that they put together in 2018. The fact that they were going up against Simple's best year in history, Nico's best year in history, and still dominating. The fact that they were winning the amount of majors that they have. No one's ever even done that, period. And so they're just so far ahead of anybody else in the past. This is a point where people don't think that an era is even possible, and Astralis do it. And Astralis do it even into the pandemic. And the first year of the pandemic in 2020 is when it gets really interesting, because Astralis still holds strong, but they're not exactly the same team they used to. You know, no one is really. And they end up falling. This is the Roman Empire of Counter-Strike, and it all ends up falling apart eventually, which is natural, you know, and their highs and their peak and their length of peak still to this day probably will never be beaten. But now the question is, Astralis put together the longest, strongest, most dominant era possible in late stage CSGO, relatively late stage CSGO. I mean, I guess it's technically only 5 years into the game is when it started. And when we talk about getting to 10 years, there's only been one other team that has really met that. Some of the qualifications of putting together an era, but barely. And that's NAVI in 2021. I mean, everybody while this was happening was constantly calling this an era, right? The NAVI were dominant. Simple had the best major run in history when he won Stockholm in 2021. The GOAT finally got his chip was the story, and everybody was just wanting to believe that it was an era and just wanted to believe their part watching Destiny unfold, you know? But those rose-tinted glasses ultimately fade when you get away from the era a little bit and you look back in the rear view and you see that things ended relatively quickly afterwards. And they do have an online Grand Slam in the mix, and a lot of teams really haven't recovered by the time that NAVI are super dominant. So as impressive as they were, and the disparity between NAVI and the rest of the competition, it was there, but it almost felt like we were in such a recession overall in terms of top talent in teams that the field wasn't thick enough to compare them to someone like Astralis or even an SK Luminosity of old, where, you know, Astralis had Cloud9 winning a major in 2018 at the same year as Nico having his best year ever, as Navi with Simple having his best year ever, specifically having so many top teams constantly competing on lands. And Navi didn't really have that quite as much, and it didn't really last that long after the fact. So that sort of becomes it, right? That's the weird part. After that, HLTV's top 1 ranking in the world, it actually used to be news. When that hit every week, you'd look at it and you go, the number 1 team on HLTV's ranking, most of the time, like 9 out of 10 times, was the number 1 team in the world. But since Navi were number 1 in 2021, I don't think that the HLTV top 1 ranking has really ever mattered. Maybe apart from the period of time where FaZe won Antwerp, but then they fell off a few months after that before finally completing their Grand Slam, you know, not putting together an era at all. And is this because there are so many teams that got good and the game has sort of gotten maxed out? There's no new piece of utility. There's no new HE grenade that people have been thinking about. The decoy hasn't been fully figured out to the point that if it's exploited well, then you can put together another era. Are there no more tools left for teams to actually push the ceiling of the game far enough ahead so that they can stand out from the second best team in the world in a way that gives them 3, 4, 5 majors in a row, Grand Slam, multiple tier 1 titles back to back? Is it possible anymore? You know, that's the golden question. And as we entered into CS2, I thought that here is the game where we see a repeat of 2013, right? Because in 2013, in the first year of CSGO, people were playing Source and 1.6 at the same time. There were lots of active players who were going to be transitioning over to CSGO. Even though NIP were one of the few top teams in CSGO that could win anything or come close to it, there were still lots of people who were trying at the same time. And CS2 offers the same opportunity, except it's brought even more competition over. And I think there's that. And then there's also the question of MR12. When MR12 is out, does that immediately get in the way of consistency? Does it immediately shorten eras because if you have an off day, you have less time to recover inside of games? Will it be possible to see what we saw in CSGO with a team winning 4 majors back to back? I mean, I want to believe yes, and I know that MR12 will make it harder, but I want to believe yes for one specific reason. And that specific reason is we never thought that Astralis in 2018 could ever put together what they did. It didn't seem like that was at all possible. Every day you wake up and you wonder, when is it going to end? How can this team keep winning and beating everybody even when there's so many good top teams? And they still did it. And I personally believe that we're still looking for our Roger Bannister here in CS2. And I think MR12 will make it harder. But I want to believe for sure that there will be a chance for a CS2 era, because now there is a reset of the utility. There's a new game with new bugs, new features, new smokes specifically, and a lot of things that are unexplored in terms of how we're going to make the most of each round. And I think that the young budding players who are just getting on board playing CS2 and thinking about the game a little bit differently than people have all this while in the past in CSGO are going to be able to show us that they can be dominant for a long time in new ways that some of the old dogs can't catch up. Is it possible we never see an era again? Yes. But I hope not. And I genuinely don't believe that that's going to happen, because that's the greatest gift that we can have. That's what gets us the most excited. That's what builds the most fans. That's what creates the best stories. Having a top team push the ceiling as far as it possibly can to the point that no one can believe it, and watching other teams scramble to find out new ways to play the game in order to catch up. I think that's the whole beauty of the game. That's why we laud Simple for having the career he did in CSGO. That's why we laud Astralis for being so dominant for so many years across so many majors. And I think that's what we need in CS2. So here's hoping that it isn't the end of eras, and here's to wondering who is going to put that together.